1,000 years ago, working with stone and wood tools, domesticating crops, and living in large communities, human groups spread from the Mississippi River Valley as far as northern Florida. They lived by gardening, hunting, and fishing, without plows or domesticated beasts of burden. Wherever they went, the Mississippians built huge earthen mounds with their chief buildings perched on top. Mounds built by this first tide of people remain today near Lake Jackson. Although occasional humans may have passed through this area even earlier, the mound builders formed the first wave of permanent, large-scale settlement in North Florida. Distance split Mississippian peoples into tribes with different dress, basketry, pottery, and even languages. Men spent a lot of time and covered incredible distances hunting, sometimes coming into conflict with hunters from other tribes. The Appalachians living in Middle Florida fought with the Timucuans living to the east of the Suwannee River, who themselves were split into competing tribal groups. Such encounters produced captured enemies, but these prisoners were seen only as unlucky people who had lost a contest, not non-human objects or property. Captives might marry partners from the capturing community. Their children were treated as ordinary full members of that community. This first tide of people to wash over the landscape of North Florida between 500 and 1,000 years ago settled into a stable cultural pattern of existence for several centuries before the next tide arrived. Then in 1513, Juan Ponce de Leon landed at several points along the coast of the Florida peninsula, but on both Atlantic and Gulf shores, hostile native warriors were as happy to attack him as they had been to attack one another. He sailed away again on other adventures, but after that the word was out. Other explorers quickly sailed from Spain to explore up and down the coast, capped by the arrival of a large expeditionary force under Hernando de Soto in 1539. For 4 years, De Soto explored throughout the southeastern part of North America, always looking for possible sources of treasure. But nothing along De Soto's route compared with the piles of gold that Cortez already was looting from the Aztec Empire in Mexico. Spanish forts built along the Gulf Coast, and especially the Atlantic coast, were there mostly to guarantee safety, support, and supply for the Spanish treasure fleets, sailing through the Straits of Florida, up the Florida coast riding the Gulf Stream, and then home across the Atlantic. Small garrisons at these forts traded with the much larger surrounding Native American populations at each site, but also had to be supplied regularly by Spanish ships with food and munitions. Soldiers in these forts often came from the prisons of Cuba and other Spanish islands. These were not desirable destinations for their occupants. A half-century after Ponce de Leon, King Philip of Spain learned in 1564 that over 300 Protestant French Huguenots had landed on the east coast of Florida to start a French colony at Fort Caroline near present-day Jacksonville. The king could not tolerate this threat to his treasure fleets. On his orders, Pedro Menendez, who commanded the treasure fleet, assembled more than 1,000 sailors, soldiers, and colonists and put to sea with orders to destroy the French colony. They arrived just a year after the French had landed. After a brief naval skirmish, the Spanish forces sailed a little south to the present location of St. Augustine. Menendez landed his forces there and hastily built some fortifications. The French commander, Jean Ribault, pursued the Spanish with his own ships, but a hurricane suddenly blew in and wrecked the whole French fleet along the Florida coast. At the same time, Menendez marched his soldiers overland through the hurricane and 2 days later surprised the French colony. The Spanish massacred the French men after they surrendered, captured the women and children, and carried them off to Spanish ports. Menendez then hunted down the shipwrecked French sailors and massacred them after they surrendered. That is why the place is called Matanzas, Spanish for massacre, and why San Agustin rather than Fort Caroline, survives as the oldest continuous European settlement in the present-day United States. Spanish priests began to spread gradually westward, moving inland from San Augustine to evangelize the large native populations around them. A Spanish bishop from Santiago in Cuba visited the region more than 100 years after the founding of San Augustine and found missions established all along the Spanish Royal Road, the Camino Real that prefigured today's Interstate 10. Missions had greatest success in the middle Florida region between the Apalachicola and Suwannee rivers, the heart of the Apalachee tribal area. The large number of these missions, along with accounts of the region as the breadbasket for Spanish holdings in Florida, suggest that the Apalachee were the most settled, advanced natives in the region, probably numbering between 8,000 and 10,000, many times the entire number of Spaniards in all of La Florida. During the second half of the 1600s, though, Spain no longer had Florida and the surrounding region of North America all to itself. The race for colonies ignited among the nation-states taking shape in Europe. Starting from places like Quebec, established permanently in 1608, French explorers and fur traders moved westward through the Great Lakes and then south down the Mississippi, eventually establishing colonial settlements at Mobile, New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and other places by the early 1700s. French traders, like Spanish conquistadors, were interested mainly in resources like gold and furs that they could carry out of the Western Hemisphere. Unlike the British, carrying in European settlers to develop colonial populations remained unimportant in French and Spanish colonies. British colonies grew fast on the Atlantic coast in the 1600s, starting with Virginia in 1607 and then spreading northward to New England. In the second half of the century, while Spanish missions slowly spread like mushrooms across North Florida, British colonies appeared along the coast in the Carolinas. The British were not preoccupied with gold, silver, or treasure fleets. Their dreams of wealth involved indigo, cotton, and other raw materials for their factories at home. On a much larger scale than for French and Spanish colonizers, the British brought with them an accompanying tide of slaves captured in Africa. They rationalized the peculiar institution of slavery into its most ruthless and oppressive form, a system of large plantations based on gang labor. Along with this plantation system, the British encouraged their own citizens to sail across the Atlantic and cover the new landscape with colonial settlements. By the end of the 1600s, British settlers outnumbered French by 20 to 1 in the New World, and the number of their slaves rivaled the numbers of settlers themselves. In contrast, the thin crust of Spanish soldiers, missionaries, and a few settlers in La Florida numbered at most in the hundreds, coexisting with native tribes numbering in the thousands. The Spanish king was never able to convince large numbers of people from Spain to settle around his Florida castillos and missions. His subjects living in these colonial outposts were predominantly mestizos, that is, Spanish subjects born in the New World. Most of the peninsulares, that is, people born in the Iberian Peninsula, were men. So many of the mestizos had one Native American parent, usually the mother. The small Spanish coastal enclaves attracted some people from the native tribes to settle nearby for trading purposes, but the Spanish never successfully developed anything like large-scale plantation agriculture in the region. The Spanish did hold African slaves in bondage like the other European colonial powers, but their version of slavery differed from the British version. As British colonies expanded, they encountered the Cherokee Nation all along the eastern slopes of the Appalachian Mountains in the Carolinas and Georgia. Down in the hilly Midlands of Georgia and Alabama lived the Creeks, with the Choctaws to the east and south of the Creeks in Mississippi and Alabama. All these tribal offshoots of Mississippian culture maintained an uneasy, shifting balance of trading and warfare with each other. Naturally, they extended the pattern of raiding and trading to the new European arrivals, attacking settlements, stealing crops and livestock, and in the case of the southern slave plantations, also carrying away enslaved people. Europeans responded by capturing Native Americans and enslaving them. To British eyes, enslaved Africans captured by the Indians seemed to prove that the Indians also practiced slavery as they understood it. A lively debate still rages about just what bondage involved among different Native American tribes, but it seems clear that it was not slavery as the British understood it. The African slaves themselves delivered the final verdict in this debate as far as we're concerned. They voted with their feet. Almost from the very start, slaves ran away from British plantations into the forest. Those forests were not empty. Runaway slaves quickly encountered the nearest Native American tribe. On the plantations, African and Indian slaves sometimes labored side by side, intermarried, and even escaped together to Indian country. They found a place in the existing native society, hunting, raising crops, and living among their new hosts. These escaped slaves, sometimes called Maroons, transformed the population of Spanish Florida. They settled widely in or near the Appalachian towns. The Black Indians, as they became known in the late 1600s, formed the third wave of population that washed over North Florida after the Mississippian cultures and European colonists. The Spanish king, always alert for any chance to tweak the noses of his unwanted British neighbors to the north, even decreed in 1693 that any African slave from British plantations could obtain freedom in La Florida simply by converting to Catholicism. This outraged the wealthy and powerful British planters. When the Spanish king died in 1700, European powers chose sides to back rivals for the Spanish throne. This War of the Spanish Succession overflowed into North America as Queen Anne's War, with Spanish and French colonies on one side and British colonies on the other. Each side had made alliances with different Native American tribes, so these tribes often fought each other alongside their chosen European allies. In La Florida, the Spanish governor ordered attacks by his soldiers and friendly natives against tribes in present-day Georgia friendly with the British. Governor Moore of South Carolina had bigger plans. With financial backing from the colony's governors and plantation owners, he collected a few British militia supported by a much larger force of Yamasee and other Native American tribes and marched south at the end of 1702 to capture San Augustine itself. The Spanish governor found out he was coming. He pulled everyone, Spaniards, the free black population, and some of his own native allies, inside the massive Castillo de San Marcos and sent messages to Cuba for help. Moore laid siege to the Castillo, but it was too strong for him to capture, so when Spanish reinforcements sailed onto the scene, he had to burn his boats and retreat in disgrace back to Charlestown. Moore was determined, though, not to let his embarrassing defeat be the last word in this conflict. A little over a year later, at the start of 1704, he again assembled about 50 British militia and over 1,000 Native American warriors. After the San Augustine failure, other leaders of the colony were skeptical of his plans, though this time he had to pay his army's wages and other costs of the expedition himself out of his own pocket. They reached the peaceful Appalachia region at the end of January. While his Yamasee and Muskogee Creek allies raided the surrounding Appalachia towns and villages, Moore captured the mission of Ayubale after a day-long siege. He then killed the resident priest and other Spanish and Appalachia defenders when they surrendered. When 30 Spanish cavalry and 400 Appalachians from Mission San Luis tried to take Ayubale, most of the Appalachians and some of the Spanish soldiers were killed or captured. Moore and his Muskogee Creek allies went on to devastate and depopulate the entire Appalachia territory, returning to South Carolina with several thousand Appalachians, mostly women and children. Some of the Appalachia reportedly actually joined Moore's forces and fought against those loyal to the Spanish. Other Appalachians escaped to San Augustine or Louisiana. Those who went north with Moore were settled among the Creeks and other tribes, or sometimes sold into slavery on plantations. The entire episode would not have been possible without Moore's shrewd manipulation of the hostility between different Native American groups, since more than 90% of his force were Creek and Yamasee warriors. When this outgoing tide of people retreated back into British territory, the Appalachee as an organized culture had been erased from North Florida, where before something like 9,000 Appalachies lived, farmed, and traded with the Spanish. Since this region had been the main source of food and other agricultural products for San Agustin, the destruction of the Appalachee greatly weakened the Spanish situation and forced greater reliance on imports from other Spanish colonies. The social and economic vacuum left by destruction of the Appalachies as an organized tribe began to fill up again as the misfortunes of one native tribe became the opportunities of others. All Native Americans were themselves under pressure from the ambitious, aggressive British colonists. At the time of Moore's raid, less than 10,000 European colonists lived in the Carolinas and the Georgia frontier region. But by 1750, half a century later, about 25,000 colonists lived in South Carolina, along with about 30,000 of their slaves. The balance had reversed from a thin crust of British on the coast, facing much larger native populations inland, to huge populations of colonists facing what had become a relatively thin crust of native tribes along the western frontier of settlement. Rapidly growing British power meant that they could simply displace the natives whenever they liked. That expansion suffered a temporary setback, though, when frontier Indian traders in the British colonies outraged all the native tribes in the region by their abusive treatment and sparked what became known as the Yamasee War in 1715. This war united most of the traditionally hostile different tribes into a single furious effort to drive all European settlers from the South Atlantic shores. It was doomed to fail, but the main targets of the native tribes' wrath were British traders, colonists, and plantation owners. Seeing his chance, the Spanish governor of La Florida invited native tribes to come and settle in the empty lands left by the Appalachies. Muskogee Creeks in particular began to migrate southward. Probably some of these migrants included survivors of the original Appalachee who had been driven north and settled among them a generation earlier. The Creek word Simano-Li meant something like separatist, outcast, runaway, free, or man of the wilderness. Fleeing from the British frontier, these Muskogee Creek migrants became known as Seminoles, forming a new tribal identity that also included members of other tribes in the shattered region, including Timucuans, Miccosukis, Yamasees, Goales, and others displaced from their traditional cultural homes by the continuing turmoil. In 1738, the Spanish directed more than 100 free black subjects of the king to move north of San Agustin and form their own new community at Fort Mose, the first free black settlement in North America. But it was too little too late for Spanish La Florida. The weakened colony was doomed. Only 2 years later, in 1740, Georgia Governor Oglethorpe invaded Spanish territory, destroyed Fort Mose, and drove the black defenders back into the safety of San Agustin to avoid recapture and a return to British plantation slavery. The Spanish counterattacked and forced Oglethorpe to withdraw, but the black community at Fort Mose was not restored for another dozen years. What finally put an end to 2 centuries of Spanish control, though, came from another quarter. Starting in 1754, colonies in North America became the main focus of what became known among the British as the French and Indian War. After 7 years of fighting, in 1761, Spanish King Charles III offered an alliance to his cousin, French King Louis XV. This was supposed to intimidate the British, but the plan backfired. British forces seized French Caribbean islands and Spanish Cuba. In 1763, French and Spanish diplomats signed a treaty in Paris handing over all French territory east of the Mississippi River, as well as Spanish Florida, to the British. In exchange, Britain returned Cuba to Spain. By the terms of this treaty, Spain evacuated all its soldiers, Catholic clergy, and settlers from La Florida. This was not as dramatic as it might sound, because by 1763 there were only 10 Spanish missionaries left in La Florida. The garrison of San Agustin, the remaining priests, and hundreds, not thousands, of Spanish settlers sailed away to Cuba and other Latin American Spanish colonies, along with some devout Native American converts to Catholicism and some Africans, both slave and free. East of the Mississippi River, British colonialism was now the only game in town.